All right, we're back, and let's talk about non-coercive paraphilias. So these are ones where you don't need an unwilling victim. So fetishistic disorder, this is where you are attracted to an inanimate object or a non-sexual body part. Some common objects, I've talked a little bit on the introduction of this, so let's expand out a little bit and talk about, common objects, feet. Some people are just repulsed by feet, and then some people are super turned on by feet, and it is a non-sexual body part. And some people become obsessed with feet, and they want them to be dirty, and they want them to, be sweaty and things like that. Shoes, again, typically prefer used, ones that have been worn. Now, I deliberately put, granny panties as underwear because it's not that the underwear has to be skimpy or lacy or any kind of attractiveness. It needs to be ideally worn for it to be an object of a fetishistic disorder. So there was a case in the 50s when probably everybody's underwear looked a lot like this picture, but where this guy was stealing underwear off of the backyard clotheslines that people were drying their underwear. And, he wanted used ones. I mean, he could go shoplift them from a store, but nobody's worn them. So he wanted ones that somebody had worn. Makes him feel more like he's in control, or that it's, like being intimate. Legs are a common object. Like I mentioned, texture can be a common object. So silk or latex or feathers or something like that. Now, any one of these things could be just considered a regular turn on. So let me revisit the issue of, atypical and kinky behavior versus, paraphilias. I'm talking about paraphilias. So I'm talking about disorder called fetishistic. In any, normal interaction, maybe high heels are really attractive normally, but it doesn't mean that the person wants to sniff them and rub them on their genitals and actually ejaculate on the shoes. Right now we're moving into a fetishistic disorder. I think we can agree. Legs, a lot of people are attracted by legs, but most people don't want legs that aren't attached to a body, right? So we're talking about like different degrees. And so with the paraphilia level of fetishistic disorder, you're talking about a person who can't function sexually without the object, or they feel personally ashamed and distressed by their impulses. Hair, again, like I said, I think, typical, a lot of people like long hair. They want to comb it and stuff, but they usually want it to still be attached to the head of the person that they are, brushing the hair. A person with a fetishistic disorder, they may have a hair collection that they keep and they touch and they rub on their genitals and stuff like that. So obviously these are, this levels of degree, right? Now, transvestic disorder, another one that's kind of tricky because it's where the person is sexually aroused by the act of cross-dressing as the opposite sex. Typically, this is going to be a man dressing in women's clothing. And so we would call a person a transvestite is sort of a casual term for a person with transvestic disorder if they get sexually aroused by putting on, let's say, ladies' panties or wearing a bra under their suit or a camisole or something like that. And the act of wearing it and knowing that if anybody knew that I had this on under my suit, they would be aghast or think it was surprising is arousing. That I've got a secret and I'm doing something that I'm not supposed to be doing. That is sexually arousing. That's different from the things that are not examples of transvestically disordered, like, for example, a person who cross-dresses for a living, right? So this is somebody from England. You could put RuPaul here. They're not sexually aroused by what they're doing. They are playing a character. Or a person who's transgender is not an example of somebody with transvestic disorder. They're a person who is transgender and they're wearing the clothing that's appropriate for the other sex. They're doing it because it actually matches how they feel on the inside. So it's different, right? With the person who is what we would call a transvestite or somebody with transvestic disorder is somebody who is being aroused by the act of wearing the other sex's clothes. It's very unusual for women to have this. I think it's possibly because there is not as much of a social prohibition against women wearing men's clothing as there is against men wearing women's clothing. And so for men to wear lacy underpants or a bra or a camisole or something like that, it has this naughtiness to it that can be really arousing. So, a lot of women will say, well, I like to wear my boyfriend's shirt and it smells like his cologne and this and that, and I find that arousing. Well, yeah, but the act of being in his shirt because you're not supposed to be is not arousing. It's because his shirt smells like him, and that's arousing. It's not the act of wearing his shirt and being, quote unquote, a deviant, right? And so a person with transvestism is a person who's aroused by the act of doing something that they know people would judge them for. All right. Now, non-coercive paraphilias. I've got sexual masochism under this because you have to get somebody to agree to make you experience pain. So you can't, they're doing it to you, so they have to be agreeing. So examples of this would be like bondage. And, there's a whole industry devoted to the idea of, a dominatrix, for example, putting a person in a dog collar or tying them up or something like that. Spanking would be another example. Generally, we're not going to be able to have a non-coercive paraphilia where the person really seriously needs the other person to voluntarily, truly harm them, right? Like it's really going to be really hard to get a non-sadistic partner who's willing to actually harm you and leave a scar and stuff like that. So you're going to notice that this list looks a whole lot like atypical sexual behaviors where, maybe we're going to have a safe word and you're going to make me crawl around and show me how dominant you are, but this is a role play and I could end it any time I want, stuff like that. So I can experience a little bit of suffering, maybe express some of the things I'm, have pent up inside of me. But the truth is I can just call it off when I'm done. And so masochism is a tougher one to have as a paraphilia because you can't really express it unless somebody's willing to do it with you. And whenever you get into consenting adults, it's hard to call it anything other than atypical, right? But here's something that is really a fearful thing that sexual masochists will do. And I am reluctant to even really want to talk about it very much, only because thank goodness for the internet to make everything seem okay. Like everything's a reasonable choice. Autoerotic asphyxiation is where a person by themselves attempts to cut off the flow of blood to their brain by compressing their carotid arteries in their neck, either in a noose or using a belt or some other device that people with too much time and a really bad idea will come up with. And they attempt to time their orgasm while masturbating to exactly the point where they're just about to pass out, and supposedly it produces a really intense orgasm. But the problem with this is that's a really tough thing to time, right? So there have been cases of people who, a lot of them are listed as suicides, but the circumstances imply that they might have been engaging in autoerotic asphyxiation, where they accidentally hung themselves. They accidentally leaned into the belt too long and they actually died. And now they get caught, they get found naked, and it's kind of suspicious circumstances, but it kind of looks like they hung themselves. Some famous people have died this way. But even if a person doesn't die from it, depriving your brain of oxygen is not a great idea. You kill brain cells every time you do it. So, but I'm loath to talk about this because I don't want to give people ideas to try it if they'd never even heard of it before. So I'm like, I'm not selling this. And then a lot of times, we try and scare people out of trying things, but that works really well with drugs or unprotected sex. So I'm not sure I can give a great warning against it, can I? But it is not something that should be being messed with. And if you have a partner who suggests that you'd really like it and we should do it, it might be a person who's really, sincere and they just want you to experience something really fun and they will not strangle you to death. But, how do you find out for sure? It's a very risky behavior. That's all I can say. And autoerotic is where the person does it to themselves. And so it falls under this sexual masochism header. All right, where do these paraphilias come from? So psychodynamic theory, this would be Freud. Freud says that things that happen to you in your childhood as you are attempting to satisfy the needs of your little id, that part, that unconscious part of your personality that just wants you to experience pleasure all the time. So things that happen to you in your childhood as you're trying to express your id get internalized into your superego, the part of your brain that is your conscience. And that's where the paraphilia probably starts, is where your superego, your conscience, your sense of shame gets bound up with natural instincts that are coming out of your id, and you can end up kind of having an incorrect impression about what's okay to do. So one example of how this can work is that you might be displaying a defense mechanism through your paraphilia. So regression is an example of a defense mechanism where you're maybe not feeling comfortable right now at whatever age or stage you are. And so you display behaviors that are consistent with an earlier stage of development. So typically, you see a child who it hasn't sucked their thumb in years, but then mom has a new baby and now suddenly they're sucking their thumb. They've regressed. Or they're wetting the bed all of a sudden. They've regressed. So us adults, we might display regression through engaging in behaviors that maybe as a child was fine. Here we have a little boy standing on the arm of a chair, peeping at something. I don't know what's on the other side of that window. Let's assume he's catching a peek of maybe somebody changing clothes. Completely reasonable or normal for a kid to do that because kids are curious and they don't really, have a lot of inhibitions. But as an adult, you're not supposed to display that behavior, but maybe something causes you to regress. You're under stress or something like that, and you start to display these kinds of behaviors again. So psychodynamic theory might look at it through the lens of regression. They might look at it through the lens of fixation, right? Where your needs at different stages of development were not adequately met. And so as an adult, you're always striving to get those needs met. And so if you left some of your energy behind at the oral stage, for example, as an adult, you might be fixated at the oral stage. And so now you need to be really dependent, which is a really, prime characteristic of that oral stage. You're a baby, you need to be taken care of. Well, as an adult, you might be fixated there. So you might display the paraphilia of needing somebody else to discipline you or be dominant over you, something like that. So psychodynamic theory is always going to kind of look through maybe these kinds of, defense mechanisms. Or it might be simply that things that you did when you were a child have gotten bound up in your id impulses for what is arousing and things like that. And so that now as an adult, you're still doing those behaviors. You revert back to them, especially when you're under stress. Psychodynamic theory is always going to look at the possibility that stress forces you back into old patterns. The other thing is that Freud's going to look at trauma that your parents might have imposed on you in their efforts to sort of quell your natural sexual impulses when you were little. And so it's the trauma. It's not the punishment. We're going to talk about another theory that looks at the punishment in a second, but it's not the punishment. It's the trauma that you experienced as a result of being punished for normal sexual impulses. So let's say if this little boy gets caught peeping like that by his dad and he spanks him and tells him how bad the little boy is and how ashamed he should be for peeping and things like that, that trauma could then bind up peeping with sexual impulses later. And next thing you know, you have a voyeur on your hands. So Freud is always going to say that in order to treat any kind of psychological disorder, the first thing we have to do is discover whatever trauma you have repressed. We all have some kind of trauma repressed. It's either the trauma of having been weaned or the trauma of having been potty trained or the trauma of having been overly punished for natural instincts, things like that. So we have to discover what it is and we have to work our way through it. And luckily for Freud, that takes a long time and you have to pay him by the hour and it can take years and yay. Now here's the theory that says maybe punishment might be helpful. So behavioral theory says that if you have, an object or a behavior that gets paired with sexual arousal, that's going to later on be associated with sex and can manifest itself in some kind of paraphilia. So let's say that this little boy, was trying on mommy's high-heeled shoes and, thought it was kind of fun, and maybe he didn't, not sexually aroused, but he was just sort of excited about it or whatever. And then mom said, "Oh, don't you do that. Boys don't walk around in high heels, and those are mommy's special, Manolo Blahniks, and bad boy, and tries to punish him." This might accidentally actually pair up for him shoes and then arousal. And so he may later on develop a paraphilia. The great news about a behavioral theory is that if you can learn this association, you can break it. So if we assume that paraphilias are learned, we assume that they can be unlearned. So one way that we can unlearn is through what's called aversion therapy. So he says, "What's with the headband?" He goes, "Oh, it's a rubber band. Every time I drive myself nuts, I snap it." His friend goes, "Nice bruise." Aversion therapy is when you try and punish a person for behaviors they shouldn't engage in, so that hopefully they won't do those behaviors anymore. Spoiler alert, that does not work. They've tried it for pedophiles where they actually shock their penises if their penis starts to become erect while watching pictures of small children or something. They may learn to not get a penis not to get an erection while there are electrodes on their penis, but that does not generalize to the real world. They realize that, that aversion treatment only occurs when there are electrodes on my penis, and no electrodes here. So it really doesn't work. That is not an effective way to get rid of behaviors. Much more effective is to engage in counter conditioning. Counter conditioning is where, maybe there's a natural response. Here we have a dog that hears a bell ring and they naturally bark. In fact, while I was lecturing a little bit ago, my dog started barking because somebody rang the doorbell. Bark, bark, bark. The idea is that you can counter condition that using something that normally doesn't cause them to bark and growl. So for example, in normal everyday life, the dog's happy and relaxed when he gets a high value treat. So what we might do is pair the bell ringing with a high value treat so that the dog starts to treat the bell like it's a treat, right? So I hear the bell, I know that predicts that a treat's coming. And so now instead of barking when I hear the bell, I get ready and excited because I know I'm going to get a treat. Okay, so that's the premise of counter conditioning. So if we have certain impulses that make us sexually aroused, we can try and figure out, maybe something else that makes you feel calm and pair that with the thing that has been inappropriately sexually arousing. And maybe eventually that inappropriately sexually arousing thing will lose its power and the response will start to be the calm or the, typical or the desirable response. It takes a little bit of work, but it works really well to do counter conditioning, way better than aversive therapy. A lot less painful too. All right. And my final explanation of the origin of paraphilias. I already talked about pedophiles and I talked about all the different theories on that. So I'm really focusing in on the other paraphilias that we've talked about. And at the very beginning, I talked about obsessions, right? Obsessive compulsive disorder is one explanation for what is going on with paraphilias. So obsessive compulsive disorder is made up of obsessions, which are thoughts that you just cannot get out of your head. And then compulsions, which are behaviors that you have to do. You feel like you have got to do this behavior. So in any obsessive compulsive disorder, we have discovered that there's this little area, see where the red arrow is pointing, that sort of heats up in a person while they're experiencing the obsessive thoughts. And the only way that they feel like they can kind of calm down that red area is to do this compulsive behavior. And then they feel a little moment of relief after they've done the compulsive act. So assuming that that's what's driving things like sadism or necrophilia or something like that, that the person has an obsession, one of the things that we can do is attempt to break that hot area by administering antidepressants. Those seem to work really pretty decently for obsessive compulsive disorder. There's another kind of medication, the category is called GABA inhibitors. GABA is the neurotransmitter that is right there in that area that heats up during an obsession. And so that medication kind of prevents the onset of an obsession. There's also cognitive behavioral therapy that works really well, where you can teach the person to relabel the obsession as just meaningless. It's just an obsession, and then go through a series of steps where ultimately they distract themselves whenever they feel that obsession coming on. And what you see in the bottom picture is after cognitive behavioral therapy, you see that area that had been lit up in the pre-picture. Now it has calmed down and the person is experiencing fewer obsessions. So there are treatments available ranging from, behavioristic treatments or psychodynamic treatments, or we could try medications or cognitive behavioral therapy. So a lot of things what you can do for paraphilias. I just really want to finish this conversation by reiterating that atypical or kinky behavior is not what we've been talking about. I really wanted to focus in on those diagnosable things that the person themselves is unhappy about, or that it interferes with their sexual functioning unless they do this behavior. I want to leave the atypical to our textbook and just focus in on these diagnosable things. So hopefully you've enjoyed this topic, and I will see you in the next chapter.